For me and you, if you grew up in Britain or anywhere outside North America, this is how Help began.
Help! I need somebody help!
But if you grew up in America, Canada, or even parts of Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, there's a good chance that your brain expects this first. And for many fans, it still does. But the strange thing is that that famous James Bond-style introduction was never actually part of the Beatles recording at all. It wasn't something the Beatles added, and if you grew up in Britain, there's a good chance you never heard it at all until years later. But despite that, for millions of North American listeners, it became completely inseparable from the song itself. And the story behind how it got there is a fascinating little glimpse into how differently Beatles records were treated in America during the 1960s. In 1965, James Bond mania was everywhere.
Goldfinger!
Goldfinger had been a huge success, and spy spoofs were appearing everywhere. And you can really feel that influence all the way through Help. And because of that, the soundtrack reflected those spy movie influences too. Unlike A Hard Day's Night, which had been scored by George Martin, the orchestral soundtrack music for Help was written by British composer Ken Thorne. According to George Martin himself, director Richard Lester preferred working with Thorne on the film score, and Martin said later, "Although the music for the first film was an enormous success, Dick Lester and I didn't get on too well. I had nothing to do with the score." So while George Martin continued producing the Beatles recordings themselves, Ken Thorne created the film's orchestral soundtrack material, which mixed Bond-style guitar music, brass, strings, and even Indian instrumentation. If that sounds remarkably like the James Bond theme, that's because it was designed to. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that's Vic Flick, the guitarist who played the famous riff on the original James Bond theme. But when asked about it years later, Flick said he had no recollection of recording the part. So who actually played it remains something of a mystery. In Britain, Help was released in the standard Beatles album format. 7 songs from the film on side 1 and 7 brand new Beatles songs on side 2. But in America, Capitol Records saw things differently. The soundtrack album for A Hard Day's Night had sold extremely well in the US, so Capitol decided to market Help as a full movie soundtrack package instead, which meant combining Beatles songs with Ken Thorne's instrumental orchestral music from the film. The album was even marketed as a deluxe soundtrack souvenir gatefold album, and according to Capitol executive Dave Dexter Jr., assembling the album was surprisingly chaotic. Years later, he recalled receiving reels of incidental music from EMI, and essentially stitching together enough material to create a marketable soundtrack LP. And somewhere during that process, a short fragment of Ken Thorne's Bond-style score music was attached to the beginning of Help. Not the recording itself, just a brief soundtrack fragment edited onto the front of the song. You still hear people today saying, "I can't hear that song without it," or "my brain automatically inserts it," while British fans often react in exactly the opposite way and find the intro intrusive or completely wrong. And in a strange way, both reactions make perfect sense. What's also fascinating is that this little soundtrack fragment may contain one of the earliest uses of sitar on any Beatles-related release. Ken Thorne's score incorporated Indian instrumentation months before Rubber Soul. At exactly the same time, George Harrison himself was becoming fascinated by Indian music during the filming of Help. George said later that his interest in the sitar began after encountering it during the filming of the Indian restaurant scenes in the movie. So this odd little American soundtrack intro unexpectedly sits right at the crossroads of 2 huge 1960s cultural obsessions, James Bond and Indian music, and the story didn't even end there. When Capitol assembled their version of 1962 to 1966 in 1973, rather than ordering up tapes from Abbey Road, they used whatever tapes they had sitting in the Capitol vaults. which meant that the Bond-style Help intro accidentally survived onto one of the biggest Beatles compilation albums of all time in the USA, Canada and Mexico. So yet another generation of North American fans grew up hearing Help that way. But today, things have changed again. The Bond intro version isn't part of the modern official streaming catalogue, meaning younger listeners may never encounter it unless they own old records or hear it on YouTube. So what was once a completely normal version of Help for millions of listeners has gradually become a strange little alternate piece of Beatles history. And maybe that's what makes it so interesting. Not just the intro itself, but the way people become emotionally attached to the version of music they grew up hearing. Let me know which version you grew up with, and whether hearing Help without the Bond intro sounds completely normal to you or strangely incomplete. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now, and thanks for watching.